56-year-old Greg Wolf backed his dusty old Jeep down the driveway and headed towards one of his favorite places, the garden center. Ever since the COVID pandemic started, his work had slowed down, so he had a lot more time on his hands for hobbies like gardening. As he cruised along the winding road, he thought about what he might want to plant. Every year, he liked to mix it up and try a few new fruits, flowers, or vegetables. Greg stopped at a red light and let his mind wander, picturing different layouts for his garden. When the light turned green, Greg put his foot on the gas pedal, but just as he entered the intersection, a black truck came barreling toward him. There was an explosion of crunching metal and shattered glass. Greg felt a blinding pain rip through his spine as his car spun across the road. And then everything went black. Three days later, Greg lay on his stomach in an operating room under fluorescent lights. Just minutes earlier, an anesthesiologist had shot him full of lidocaine to numb his spine for surgery. And as he began to feel the medicine kicking in, it occurred to him that this was actually the first time he had not been in pain since the car accident. Even though Greg had been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash, the impact of the crash had broken a vertebrae in his back. He'd been in the hospital for days while doctors did everything they could to try to stabilize his injury. Once he'd regained consciousness following the crash, doctors told Greg that he was very lucky. The accident could have been much worse. Greg had suffered what's known as a stable fracture. This meant that when his vertebrae cracked, it stayed in the same place rather than being knocked out of alignment. So the nerve endings in Greg's spinal column were not affected. If they had been, Greg could have been paralyzed. To relieve his pain, Greg's doctors had decided to perform a surgery called kyphoplasty, which corrects small fractures like the one in his vertebrae. This was the surgery he was being prepped for right now. A few minutes later, the doctor arrived and greeted Greg and walked him through what was going to happen. Greg was going to remain conscious during the procedure. Then, after Greg acknowledged that he was ready to go, Greg felt the doctor's hands on his back, followed by a dull pressure as a large, hollow needle entered his spine. After the needle was in place, the doctor inserted a balloon-like device into Greg's vertebrae through the needle and gently inflated it until it opened up a small space in the bone. Into this space, the doctor then injected a special type of liquid cement. As the cement settled in the cracked vertebrae, it hardened and bonded against the bone. This would stabilize Greg's spine while staying flexible enough to allow him a full range of motion. And critically, it would also help reduce Greg's pain. Within a week, the doctor said he'd be feeling like his old self. Greg felt the pressure in his back start to fade as the doctor withdrew the needle from his spine. A few minutes later, a nurse came in and wheeled Greg down the hall to a recovery room to rest. As the anesthesia began to wear off, Greg did feel soreness in his spine, but the pain was mild. And after what he'd been through, this felt like a gift. A few hours later, as Greg got dressed and ready to go home, the surgeon came by to check on him. He recommended that Greg only take showers, not baths, for a few days to allow the wound on his back to heal, and he should avoid any heavy lifting for at least a week. But otherwise, his life would be just like before the surgery. Riding home from the hospital with his wife, Greg felt like he had miraculously avoided a tragedy. Now, he could get back to enjoying his life. But, only 7 days later, Greg was back in the emergency room. Everything hurt. His chest, his neck, his jaw. Even turning his head sent shivers of pain rippling through his body. The first few days back at home had been fine. He was able to take walks and cook, even do a little gardening, but on the 5th day, he began to feel this new kind of pain in his chest. Following the doctor's advice, Greg checked his wound from the surgery to see if it was infected. But the wound looked fine, so he decided to turn in early that night and hope he would feel better in the morning. However, over the next 2 days, Greg's pain only spread. Greg tried to relax and avoided doing anything strenuous, but almost any movement, even just turning his head, hurt like crazy. He thought he felt well enough to weed his garden, and that's when the pain suddenly became almost blinding. It was so intense that Greg thought he was having a heart attack. And so now he was lying on a bed in an emergency room, trying not to move a muscle. The pain still flickered through his chest and neck. He could barely breathe. Greg had never felt anything like this. It felt even worse than what he imagined a heart attack was like. Greg just hoped that whatever was happening, it was not too late to fix it. ER doctor Miranda Gibbs was just coming back from lunch when an x-ray technician stopped her in the hallway with an update. There was something seriously wrong with her new patient, Greg Wolf. She followed the technician to his office and looked at Greg's x-rays displayed on his computer. Greg's spine looked fine. His recent kyphoplasty surgery had clearly repaired his cracked vertebrae. But something else she saw in Greg's x-ray disturbed her. Dr. Gibbs pulled out her phone and called the medical imaging department. She told them she needed to book a CT scan for her patient immediately. 2 hours later, the images had been processed and were ready for her inspection. Sitting in her office, Dr. Gibbs struggled to comprehend what she was even looking at. She grabbed the phone and called the ER. She hoped there was a trauma surgeon on duty or somewhere nearby, because Greg Wolf was a pinprick away from disaster. An hour later, Greg was on his back, unconscious. His chest had been surgically opened. A surgeon leaned over him, looking in at Greg's heart. The surgeon maneuvered until he found what he was looking for. A long, thin, 4-inch object. It had pierced through the upper right chamber of Greg's heart and also cut into his right lung. This is what Dr. Gibbs had seen in the images of Greg's chest. Now, the strange object was just sitting there, simultaneously poking Greg in the heart and lung. The surgeon steadied himself and carefully gripped the object with his tool. Any abrupt movement could cause a tear in Greg's heart or lung. The damage could be fatal. As he began to pull the object out, the surgeon was surprised at how hard the object was. It was like a stone, pale, pointed, and slightly curved. Little by little, the surgeon pulled the hard little dagger out from Greg's organs, until finally it was free. Examining it in the light, it looked a bit like one of those heavy-duty needles used to repair upholstery or carpet, except it was made of medical-grade cement. It would turn out, during Greg's back surgery, a small splash of the liquid cement had leaked out of his vertebrae into his body. Once there, it hardened into a sliver and basically followed through Greg's bloodstream, eventually reaching his heart. Greg's sudden stabs of pain he was feeling were from the tip of the cement needle piercing his heart. His trouble breathing was the needle literally poking his lung. If he had waited even 24 more hours to go to the ER, the needle could have stabbed him even more deeply and potentially killed him. Fortunately, doctors were able to repair the tear in Greg's heart and his lung, and after being sewn back up, he made a quick recovery. Only 1 month later, Greg Wolf was back in his garden in full health. He had dodged 2 near-death experiences in 2 weeks, and he had no intention of trying for a third. And now here's our second story called Killer Fashion. On a cold, clear afternoon in February of 2000, after a long, bumpy ride through snow-capped mountains, 15-year-old Ahmet Balik stepped off a bus into the city center of Erzurum, Turkey. The urban bustle was a culture shock for a country kid like him. He had spent his whole life in the small Turkish village where he was born, helping his family tend land and herd livestock. But 2 weeks earlier, Ahmet's uncle had found him a job in a textile factory in Erzurum. So here he was, surrounded by cars and buses and people, with businesses and cafes stretching down every block. It was a lot for Ahmet to process, but he was thrilled to be in this new environment and to start this exciting new chapter. He grabbed his bag from the bus's luggage compartment and headed straight for his new job. As he walked through the city, Ahmet had to stop every few blocks to catch his breath. Erzurum was a high, mountainous city, and so the air was thinner up there. He could feel the difference in his lungs. Eventually, Ahmet found the factory, walked inside, and introduced himself. His boss gave him a quick tour of the facility. As they walked around, Ahmet saw long rows of industrial looms and conveyor belts loaded with fabric, and he also saw another part of the building that was filled with workers hunched over sewing machines. Then, Ahmet followed his boss to a back area of the factory where narrow pallets were clustered in a corner. The man told him that was actually where many of the workers without families would sleep, since the hours were long and the factory was a good distance from most residential areas. Now, Ahmet really needed this job to work, and he would do whatever it took. So he smiled and tossed his bag on one of the pallets and followed his boss to begin his training. 4.5 years later, in July of 2004, Ahmet wiped the sweat from his face as he paced the crowded waiting room of a government hospital. He was 19 years old, but he felt much older. His life at the factory had been a whirlwind, getting up at dawn, shuffling to the assembly line, then sewing and finishing garments until dark. He and a couple other workers shared an apartment near the city center, but some nights he was too tired to make the walk back. So on those nights, he just curled up on the floor of the factory until it was time to get up and start the next day's shift. And before long, the late nights and early mornings began to take their toll. His sleep got worse, which only made the days feel longer. Ahmet also developed a bad cough, and gradually it got so severe that he began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. The exhaustion also affected his appetite, and he started losing weight. And this only made Ahmet feel weaker and more fatigued. It was a vicious cycle. A year earlier, in the fall of 2003, his condition had gotten so bad that he began making mistakes at work. He confused the measurements of seams and hems. He skipped entire steps of the production process. In November of that year, some shops complained about the quality of their orders, and the errors were traced back to Ahmet. When Ahmet's boss confronted him about the problem, Ahmet tried to pass it off as an accident, but Ahmet's boss could tell something deeper was wrong. So he removed Ahmet from the work schedule until his health improved. Without a job, Ahmet felt lost. His small amount of savings quickly dwindled. Ahmet tried to find other work, but Erzurum was full of young men who were hungry for similar jobs. And since Ahmet looked visibly ill, most employers turned him away. Ahmet had been able to scrape by on savings through the winter, but by the spring of 2004, Ahmet was broke. His roommates tried to be understanding, but told Ahmet that he would have to move out if he couldn't keep up with his share of the rent. And so, if Ahmet couldn't find a job soon, he would soon have no choice but to move back to his family's home in the country. Unfortunately, Ahmet's time away from the factory did not improve his health. He was still sleeping poorly, he felt run down, dizzy, and exhausted, and then one scorching summer morning in July, Ahmet woke up so out of breath that he couldn't even make it to a job interview he had booked. He realized something serious might be wrong with him, so Ahmet took a cold shower, threw on clothes, and dragged himself to the government hospital across town. Now, here he was, weak and lightheaded, pacing a waiting room full of sick people. An hour later, a nurse called Ahmet's name. He was taken to a treatment room where a tired-looking doctor listened while Ahmet described his symptoms. When he was done, the doctor told Ahmet he most likely had tuberculosis, commonly called TB, a contagious bacterial disease of the lungs. For hundreds of years, TB had been one of the world's deadliest diseases. But thanks to the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, it was now a very treatable illness. The doctor guessed that Ahmet had caught TB in the factory, since the disease spreads easily in confined spaces. All it takes is being near the wrong cough or sneeze. The doctor said that most likely the disease had lingered in his lungs ever since. Ahmet was surprised by the diagnosis, especially considering the doctor didn't actually run any tests. But it seemed like an obvious enough explanation, and he was honestly just relieved to have an explanation at all for his trouble breathing and fatigue. And so the doctor prescribed Ahmet medication that would stop the TB from being contagious within 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, all of Ahmet's symptoms would be gone. Ahmet was thrilled. If the doctor was right, he could be back in the factory within a month, making his full wages again. He wouldn't have to move back home after all. Even better, he would finally stop coughing and be able to sleep through the entire night. 1 month later, in August of 2004, a pulmonologist named Dr. Yusuf Kaya went to meet a new patient at the Ataturk University Clinic in Erzurum. The patient was a 19-year-old factory worker named Ahmet. He reported having trouble breathing, a painful cough, and intense fatigue. As soon as Dr. Kaya stepped into the treatment room, he could tell from the teenager's face alone that something was deeply wrong. Ahmet's skin looked waxy and sickly. It looked like he'd barely slept in days. Ahmet explained to Dr. Kaya that he had been taking TB antibiotics for a full month, but hadn't seen any sign of improvement. He felt weak and run down, and no matter how deeply he tried to breathe, he just couldn't get enough air. Dr. Kaya found this very worrying. If Ahmet had TB, then the antibiotics definitely should have helped him by now. But since his body was not responding, Dr. Kaya wondered what else might be causing Ahmet's symptoms. The doctor placed a stethoscope on Ahmet's chest. The teenager's heartbeat was normal, however, his breathing sounded shallow. Dr. Kaya told Ahmet that he wanted to run some tests to figure out why the TB medication was not working. He proposed starting with an X-ray of Ahmet's chest, followed by a full-body CT scan to provide a more detailed 3D rendering of Ahmet's organs. After that, Dr. Kaya suggested doing a bronchoscopy, which uses a thin, illuminated tube to examine the lungs and airways. Separately, he also wanted to test Amet's blood, mucus, and saliva for disease or infection. Amet told Dr. Kaya that his number one goal was getting back to his job at the factory, so whatever was necessary to make that happen, Dr. Kaya should do it. A few days later, after all the tests had been performed, Dr. Kaya opened a link on his computer to inspect Amet's results, and what he saw made him very concerned. Amet's chest X-ray looked speckled, particularly in his lungs. This indicated the presence of small foreign objects in Amet's lungs that shouldn't be there. His CT scan was more detailed. In addition to the foreign objects, it showed small growths in his lungs known as micronodules, which are often caused by respiratory illnesses or infections. And a culture test of his phlegm confirmed that Amet did not have TB. Dr. Kaya had suspected this when Amet's TB treatment didn't have any effect, but it was a relief to see it medically proven. But even so, ruling out TB didn't get Dr. Kaya any closer to figuring out what was causing Amet's symptoms. The cumulative picture provided by Amet's tests indicated that there was some sort of serious infection in his lungs. It just wasn't clear what that might be. So Dr. Kaya canceled Amet's TB medication and replaced it with a more general antibiotic. Dr. Kaya hoped this would ease Amet's symptoms, but he knew antibiotics wouldn't fix anything. Until he identified the infection in Amet's lungs, it wouldn't go away, and it very well might get worse. He just didn't know how much worse. Amet was already struggling to breathe, and less oxygen in his lungs meant less oxygen to his brain. And if that trend continued, things could get very bad very quickly. A few weeks later, Dr. Kaya was scanning the paperwork of the clinic's latest patients when something caught his eye. It was the intake form of a young man named Ali. He was 18, only a year younger than Amet, and suffering from very similar symptoms: struggling to breathe, dry mouth, bad cough, unusual fatigue. Dr. Kaya decided to pay him a visit at the clinic. Maybe Ali could provide a clue as to what was making Amet so sick. After introducing himself, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to describe the history of his symptoms. And right away, one detail surprised him. Ali worked at the same garment factory as Amet. Dr. Kaya wondered why two otherwise healthy young men would have breathing issues or lung infections at their age. Neither of them smoked, and they spent their days doing physical labor, which in theory should have made them stronger, not weaker. Taking a seat by Ali's bed, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to walk him through a regular day at the factory. The jobs he did, the machines he used, what he ate, all of it. Ali explained that he started at the factory doing heavy labor, like loading and unloading fabric from the trucks to the machines and back. But over time, he was trained to do more skilled work, putting the finishing touches on garments before they were shipped to shops around the world. Ali and Amet's factory produced contemporary clothing for the latest fashion trends of the 2000s. Some of their factory's techniques were extremely new to the industry, and they sounded pretty strange to the doctor. But as Ali described his responsibilities, Dr. Kaya began to get an idea. And by the end of their chat, Dr. Kaya felt confident that he actually knew what was happening to both Ali and Amet. However, to be certain, he would need to examine samples of Ali and Amet's lung tissue under a microscope, and so he ordered lung biopsies for both men. Days later, the lung tissue samples confirmed Dr. Kaya's hunch. Both men were suffering from silicosis, a disease more commonly found in miners than garment factory workers. It's a lung disease caused by breathing silica, which is a common mineral in sand, gravel, clay, granite, and other rocks. Dr. Kaya had diagnosed cases of silicosis before, but only in workers who spent their days in tunnels or moving heavy stone materials and breathing in all kinds of rock dust. He would never have thought textile factory workers would have silicosis, since their product was fabric, not rock. But fashion tastes had changed in Europe and America in the early 2000s. One of the most popular and profitable items that Amet and Ali's factory produced was something called distressed jeans, and making them involved a lot of rock dust. To create the hip, faded denim look, workers used a high-pressure air compressor to blast sand up and down the legs of a pair of jeans. The silica particles in the sand gradually shredded the denim, giving the jeans a worn-in, weathered look. Like a lot of factories in Turkey at the time, Ahmet and Ali's workplace was crowded and lacked proper ventilation. This meant the silica particles stayed in the air long after the jeans were sandblasted. And so Ahmet and Ali breathed these particles in all day. And then at night, if they slept on the factory floor, they would continue to breathe in the silica during their sleep. Over time, the tiny crystals of silica scar and harden the delicate tissues in the lungs, making them less effective at processing oxygen. That's why the men's breathing became increasingly shallow. Sadly, silicosis damage is permanent, and it often leads to other respiratory illnesses. Lung cancer is a common outcome, and there is no cure. Even after Dr. Kaya identified Ahmet and Ali's condition, their health steadily worsened, and in 2008, both young men died from silicosis complications. And they were not alone either. 4 other workers at the same factory died as well, and 16 others suffered debilitating lung damage. In March of the following year, Turkey's Ministry of Health banned denim sandblasting, and thankfully, sandblasted jeans quickly fell out of fashion. A hot July afternoon in 2011, 43-year-old Roberto Ayala drove his white Ford F-250 truck down a private farm road past a field of sunflowers in full bloom. Roberto had worked that farmland outside of the small town of Colusa, California, since he was a young man, but looking out at that sea of yellow flowers in the sunlight still took his breath away. Roberto glanced over at the passenger seat and saw his 7-year-old son, Fabian, staring out the window, also transfixed by the flowers. Roberto smiled. He wanted all 3 of his kids to appreciate the beauty of nature as much as he did. The sunflower field was part of 1,800 acres of farmland owned by the Moore brothers, 2 wealthy and powerful men in their 70s. Roberto had started working for the Moore brothers decades earlier as a farmhand, and the brothers had taken to Roberto almost immediately. They thought Roberto was a natural farmer who understood the land even better than they did. And so the Moore brothers had quickly come to trust and rely on Roberto. They had looked to him to weigh in on major decisions about their farmland, like what to plant and when to plant it. And within a short period of time, Roberto had gained more responsibility within the Moore brothers' family business, and eventually they made Roberto their farm manager. Managing the Moore brothers' multi-million-dollar farm was a stressful job, but Roberto loved it. And he looked up to the Moore brothers like father figures who had given him a chance to succeed and who trusted him like he was part of their own family. In his truck, Roberto eased off the gas, pulled to the side of the road, and parked. He told his son Fabian to wait in the truck while he went out and did a couple of chores. Roberto's job, managing the Moore brothers' farmland, often required him to be on call 7 days a week, from sunup to sundown. So Roberto often took one of his 3 kids with him when he had to check on something at the farm. It gave Roberto a chance to spend some time with his kids, and he had already started to train his older son in aspects of farm management, in the hope his son would take over for him someday. But when Roberto was with his 7-year-old Fabian, he didn't pressure the boy to learn anything about farming unless Fabian asked. Roberto just liked sitting in his truck talking with Fabian in both English and Spanish, and giving him a chance to take in the beautiful Northern California scenery. Roberto grabbed a pair of rubber electrical gloves sitting between him and Fabian, and then he hopped out of the truck into the summer sun. Roberto was not a big guy, but he was very strong. He wore jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and he had salt and pepper hair and a thick, dark mustache. He took off his cowboy hat and wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. Then he put his hat back on and walked away from the truck down the road a few feet towards a tall wooden pole that had a high-voltage electrical box on it about the size of a high school locker. Roberto slipped on his electrical gloves and opened the box. This large metal box was one of many on the Moore brothers' farmland that housed electrical switches that controlled irrigation pumps used to water the fields of different crops at different times. Roberto turned on the irrigation pump, closed the metal box, pulled off his gloves, and began walking back towards his truck. But he stopped on the side of the road when he saw another truck driving towards him. The truck stopped a few feet away from Roberto's truck, and Paul Moore, the son of one of the 2 Moore brothers, stepped out. Paul was 47 years old, He was 6 feet tall, good-looking, and he had brown hair and green eyes. Paul waved to Roberto's son, Fabian, who was still sitting in his dad's truck, and then Paul trotted his way over to Roberto. Roberto had worked alongside Paul for almost 20 years. When they were younger, they had both worked in the fields together, but now as Paul got older, he had moved more into helping run the business side of the family farm. Paul and Roberto got along well, and they regularly checked in with each other, and it was assumed by almost everyone in the company that when the older Moore brothers retired, Paul and Roberto would essentially run the farm together. Paul and Roberto asked each other how their families were doing, and then they shifted gears and began talking a bit about the current sunflower and rice crops growing on the farmland. But then Paul got a strange look on his face, like he was embarrassed by what he was about to say. Roberto asked him what was wrong, and Paul said it was about his cousin, Peter. Roberto smiled and kind of shook his head. It was rarely good news when Peter came up. Peter Moore was a couple years younger than his cousin Paul, and the two had basically been raised as brothers. Their fathers had run the family farming business together for decades, and they had always intended to pass the land and the business onto their sons, who they hoped would run things together just like they had. But Peter had just never seemed ready to take on any real responsibility. When he was young, he had worked in the fields alongside Paul and Roberto, but he always seemed angry about one aspect of the job or another. And over the years, he had gained the reputation of having a bad temper, and he spent a lot of his time complaining about the way he felt mistreated by his father and his uncle. And over the years, Peter had also made a habit of blaming a lot of his problems on Roberto. He said Roberto was arrogant and bad at his job, and that he didn't deserve the respect he got from the Moore brothers. On the side of the road, Roberto asked Paul what Peter had done. Paul took a breath and told him that Peter was looking for a fight with Roberto, like a real physical confrontation. Roberto laughed. That sounded like something a kid would say. But Paul told Roberto he was being serious. Peter had spent years taking martial arts classes, and now he wanted to literally fight Roberto. Roberto laughed again. He thanked Paul for the heads up, but he said there was no way he was going to physically fight Peter or anyone else for that matter. Then Roberto and Paul shook hands, said they'd talk soon, and walked back to their trucks. Once he was back in his truck, Roberto asked his son, Fabian, if he'd had a good time coming to work with him. And Fabian said he had, and that he wanted to come to work with his dad more often. Roberto said, "Great, it's a deal," and then he hit the gas, drove down the road, and left the field of yellow sunflowers behind them. That night, Roberto, his wife, and 3 children sat around the dinner table talking. And Roberto laughed all over again when he told his family about how Peter wanted to fight him. Fabian and his big brother laughed along with their dad, but Roberto's wife and daughter were not amused. Roberto's daughter didn't like Peter at all, and she didn't trust him. She had gone to work with her dad a lot over the years, and she was old enough to understand that Peter did have it out for her dad. In fact, Peter didn't even hide his disdain for Roberto, and she had heard Peter say mean things about her father right in front of her. But Roberto told his daughter and his wife that there was nothing to worry about. Peter was all talk, and he would never have the guts to actually try to fight him. But later that night, as Roberto's wife lay in bed next to him, she was still worried. As far as she was concerned, Peter was an angry, rich man who acted like the world owed him something. And she feared Peter would follow through with his latest threat, no matter how foolish Roberto thought it sounded. A couple of weeks later, on July 16, 2011, Roberto was back in his white Ford F-250 with his 7-year-old son, Fabian, at his side in the passenger seat. Roberto was in his usual work clothes, jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and Fabian wore a cowboy hat too, exactly like his dad's. At about 1 p.m., Roberto drove past the sunflower fields, and a few minutes later, he glanced out his window towards one of the Moore brothers' rice fields. He pulled the truck over and parked on the side of the road. Roberto told his son to wait in the truck, and then he grabbed his electrical gloves, and he hopped out and walked towards a large metal high-voltage box on a wooden pole like he had done a couple weeks earlier. It was time for Roberto to irrigate this rice field. As his dad walked off, Fabian stayed in the truck as he was told, staring back at the sunflower fields in the distance. The young boy already shared his dad's appreciation for the beautiful flower. Then suddenly, Fabian felt the ground begin to shake, and the windshield glass shattered. Without thinking, Fabian threw his hands up in front of his face, and he felt shards of glass stinging his arms. Fabian screamed and looked around, totally confused. Growing up in Northern California, Fabian was already familiar with earthquakes, and for a second, he thought that's what this must have been. But then, Fabian stepped out of the truck, and he felt an intense heat on his face. He stumbled towards where his dad had walked off to, and when he looked out towards the rice fields, he began screaming and crying. He called out to his dad, but his dad didn't respond. Fabian looked up and down the isolated farm road, but there was nobody in sight, so the 7-year-old boy just turned around and began running back down the road towards the sunflower field. Fabian ran as fast as he could, and as he did, his cowboy hat fell off the back of his head, but Fabian didn't even stop to pick it up. He just kept on running. Several minutes later, Fabian reached the sunflower field. He'd gone to work with his dad enough to know there was a small neighborhood on the other side of this field, so he rushed into the tall stalks of the flowers and ran through the field as fast and as hard as he could. But as Fabian ran, he felt his feet sinking into the mud that recent irrigation had caused. Fabian stopped, bent down, and pulled off his shoes and socks. Then he just kept on running through the field barefoot, holding his shoes in his hands. As he ran, tears streamed down his face, mud covered his feet, and his legs felt like they were on fire, but Fabian did not stop. Finally, after running 2 miles barefoot in the hot summer sun, the 7-year-old boy burst out of the field into a clearing. He looked up and he saw a few small houses on the other side of the clearing, so despite being totally out of breath, he forced himself to just keep on running. When he reached the other side, Fabian stumbled up the walkway to the first house he came to, and he knocked on the door and screamed at the top of his lungs. Seconds later, the door flew open, and a woman saw the little boy standing there yelling and covered in mud. The woman rushed out of her house, wrapped her arms around the boy, and pulled him inside. She asked him what was going on, and Fabian coughed and wheezed, and he looked up at the woman and he told her he had come from the rice field with his dad, and his dad was on fire. The woman grabbed her phone and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes after the woman called 911, Detective Dave Salm of the Colusa County Sheriff's Department stepped out of the small sheriff's station and walked across the lot to his car. Along with this 911 call, the sheriff's department had gotten multiple calls from people all over the place saying they had heard a loud explosion coming from the Moore Brothers farm. Detective Salm got into his car and headed out towards the farm road near the rice field where Roberto and Fabian had been. Calls like this were not a regular thing in Colusa County, but they weren't too out of the ordinary either. As a sheriff's detective, Salm spent a good amount of his time investigating potential industrial accidents in the area. Farming was dangerous business, and unfortunately, Salm had witnessed his share of serious injuries and deaths related to faulty farm equipment and just plain bad luck. Thick black smoke hung in the air as Salm pulled onto the farm road that led to the rice field. He hit the gas and sped toward the road, and soon he could see the swirling lights of the fire trucks up ahead. And as he got closer, the heat from a burning fire hit him even inside of his car. Salm pulled over to the side of the road far enough away from the scene that he wouldn't interfere with the fire department who was trying to put out the fire. And after several minutes, the fire department got the blaze that had engulfed part of the rice field under control. By that time, a few other officers from the sheriff's department had arrived, so Salm led his small investigative team down the road to where the fire had been put out. He walked past Roberto's white truck, and he saw shattered glass from the windshield and windows scattered over 10 feet on the ground. Then he walked closer to the rice field, and he saw the splintered fragments of what used to be a tall wooden pole. The large metal box that had once been attached to this pole was nowhere to be found. Just then, a member of the fire department approached Salm. The two men had worked together several times before. The firefighter led Salm and his team past pieces of metal on the ground and around behind one of the fire trucks. When they got back there, Salm could still see the smoke in the air and he could feel it in his lungs, and he covered his mouth and his nose and then looked down at the ground. And when he did, he shuddered. Because he was staring at the burnt remains of a person. It was the charred body of Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm tried to catch his breath, but the smoke and the shock of the sight of Roberto made it very hard to breathe. Salm had investigated plenty of industrial accidents, but he'd never seen anything even close to this. Salm knelt down to get a better look at Roberto, and it was obvious he'd been badly burned for an extended period of time. But Roberto's cowboy boots looked like they'd almost remained untouched. So Salm got down as low as he could and craned his neck to get a good look at the bottom of Roberto's boots, and he saw there were several burn holes, each an inch wide on the sole of the boots. Salm called over members of the fire department. He thought he knew what those burn holes meant, but he wanted a second opinion. So a few of the firefighters crouched down next to Salm, and they looked at Roberto's boots as well, and all of them agreed the holes on the bottom were a clear sign of electrocution. Even though the wooden pole had been obliterated, Salm knew there had been a high-voltage unit attached to it at some point. So he sent members of his team to go look for parts of this locker-sized metal box that would have housed the electrical switch that controlled the irrigation pumps. And while the team fanned out to look for remnants of the box, Salm and members of the fire department talked through what they thought they were seeing. They had all encountered electrocution in industrial accidents, but this scene just seemed different than anything any of them had dealt with before. There was so much damage to the wooden pole, to the rice field, and even to Roberto's truck that this looked like a far bigger thing than just a malfunction within the high-voltage box. Detective Salm prided himself on his work ethic and his commitment to his community, but he never pretended to be some kind of Sherlock Holmes who could figure everything out. And he was more than willing to admit that he had no idea what had happened to Roberto and that he badly needed help investigating this. And so Salm grabbed his phone and reached out to Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility company that provided natural gas and electricity services to millions of Californians. And later that day, that company sent crewmen out to the scene, but when they arrived, they felt as lost as Detective Salm was. They told him they had never seen a blast radius on that scale in any kind of incident involving a high-voltage unit like the one Roberto would have been using. Then, members of Salm's team returned to the scene with the door of the high-voltage box that was on that pole, and they said they had found it over 150 feet away from where it had first been on the pole. And when Salm and members of the fire department heard how far that door had flown from this explosion, they admitted that they really didn't know if the explosion had been an accident or if maybe it had been caused by a bomb on purpose. On July 17th, so the day following the deadly explosion, Detective Salm drove back out to the farm road where Roberto had been killed. As Salm drove, he felt his eyelids getting heavy. He'd barely slept at all since arriving at the scene the day before, and he still didn't even know if he was dealing with an accident or a crime. But that was not what had kept him awake. The night before, Salm and members of his team had checked on Roberto's son, Fabian, at the hospital, where the boy had been brought after running 2 miles barefoot to get help for his father. Then the officers had driven Fabian home. Roberto's wife had gotten the initial call from police telling her that Fabian had been taken to the hospital. Roberto's wife spoke Spanish, and she usually had Roberto or one of the kids translate for her. But nobody else had been in the house when she had gotten the call, and so there had been communication issues between her and the police officer on the other line. That meant when police had arrived at the house with Fabian, his mother, Roberto's wife, still didn't know what had happened to her husband. And when Fabian had walked in, she ran and hugged him and then asked where his dad was. And Fabian, the 7-year-old, had to tell her that dad is dead. Everything about the scene at the house had been totally gut-wrenching. Roberto's family cried, while the 2 oldest kids translated the story of what had happened to their father to their mother. And all the while, they all tried to make sure Fabian was somehow okay after having just seen his father's body burning right in front of him and then needing to run 2 miles at a dead sprint to try to get help. In his car, Salm shook himself awake and focused on the road ahead of him. And after he'd driven a couple of miles, he saw up ahead a swarm of law enforcement vehicles blocking the road. Seeing the heartbreak of Roberto's family right up close and personal had made Salm really want to figure out what had happened to Roberto as quickly as possible, and that meant he first had to determine if Roberto's death was an accident or a murder. But by the end of the previous day, Salm and the others had still been at a total loss. So Salm had done the only thing he could think of. He contacted 2 federal agencies for help: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. The ATF was the agency that investigated federal crimes involving arson, explosives, and bombs. Salm parked his car on the farm road, stepped outside, and almost instantly regretted his decision to call the feds. The appearance of the FBI and ATF had surely already terrified residents in that small town near the Moore Brothers farm, and those agencies could completely overwhelm a county's resources while taking over from local law enforcement. Salm smiled and waved at the big group of feds out in front of him as he approached a particular ATF agent who was on the scene, but all Salm could think about was how he had possibly brought this circus to town for nothing more than maybe just an industrial accident. The ATF agent he approached introduced himself to Salm. The agent was tall and skinny, and he wore glasses, and Salm thought the guy seemed oddly excited for somebody who was in town to investigate a horrible death. But the ATF agent told Salm that they found evidence he needed to see. The agent led Salm down the road past several other members of the ATF and also the FBI, and then walked him over to a large piece of metal that was laid out on the ground. The agent said someone had found this piece of metal in a canal not far from the rice field and brought it to the agents because the person thought it might have something to do with the explosion that had occurred. And the agent said that that person was right. He crouched down and motioned for Salm to do the same, and then once they both were down there, the agent pointed to a series of markings on this piece of metal. Salm just stared at the agent and asked him what they were looking at. The agent said he would need to run a series of tests on the metal fragment to determine exactly what had happened, but the markings on the piece clearly indicated that some type of bomb had been detonated in the high-voltage box that housed the switch for the irrigation pump. In short, the agent said this had not been an accident at all. Somebody had definitely murdered Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm exhaled and his shoulders relaxed. He was horrified that somebody would want to kill Roberto, a man who was well liked in the area, who was also a husband and a father. But this news at least let Salm know that he had been right to ask for help from the FBI and ATF because this was a crime. The ATF agent told Salm it would take some time for them to search the entire site and to run all the tests they needed to run, but Salm could definitely launch a murder investigation immediately. Salm thanked the agent, and then he headed back to the sheriff's station to regroup with his investigative team and to inform them they now had a very public murder case on their hands. But it didn't take long for investigators to get their first lead. That afternoon, Salm got a call from a guy who said he had to talk to him immediately. The man's name was Paul Moore, and he said he might know who killed Roberto. Later that day, Paul Moore, the heir to the Moore Brothers farming business, stepped into the sheriff's station. Salm had been waiting for Paul to arrive, and so when he did, he went right over to him, shook his hand, and thanked him for coming in. Everybody in the sheriff's department knew Paul well from just living in the area, and they were used to seeing him laughing, telling stories, and pretty much just lighting up any room he walked into. But Salm could tell on this day, something was very wrong. Paul looked pale and worried, and when he greeted Salm, his voice was quiet and shaky. Salm, along with another detective, led Paul into a small office and closed the door behind them so they could talk privately. Paul took a seat at a small table, and the detective sat down across from him. Then Salm asked Paul what prompted him to reach out to police. Paul cleared his throat, and then in a quiet voice, he told them what had happened over the course of the last day. Paul said that he and his father had been eating a late lunch together when they got the call about Roberto. At first, both men had just sat there in shock. Roberto was like part of their family, and they couldn't even come to terms with the fact that he was now gone. But once they heard there had been some sort of explosion and that's what had killed Roberto, they immediately began to blame themselves. Everyone in the company, including Roberto, was diligent about keeping their equipment as safe as possible. So the idea that a faulty electrical box had just killed Roberto just destroyed Paul and his father. But then, earlier that morning, after the ATF and FBI had rolled into town, Paul and his father knew something else was going on. And because of their status in town, they had been able to get information quickly about what appeared to be a criminal investigation, not a query into an industrial accident. Psalm and the other detective nodded and said Paul was right. There was no use pretending the Moore family didn't know everything about what was happening on and around their farm at all times. But Psalm then followed up and said, well, okay, but why did that prompt you to reach out? Paul looked both detectives in their eyes, and he said as soon as he realized somebody may have killed Roberto, there was only one person who came to mind, and that was his own cousin, Peter. A look came across Psalm's face like he'd just heard the most obvious thing ever, and he couldn't believe he hadn't already thought of it. Detective Psalm, like almost everyone in town, knew about Peter's bad temper and about his strained relationship with his father and his uncle. Paul said that his cousin Peter had always been a total jerk to Roberto, and just recently, he had even threatened to physically fight Roberto. Paul usually just told himself that his cousin was all talk and that he would never actually do anything to Roberto, but recently, Paul said Peter really seemed more angry than usual at Roberto. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand was shaking as he pulled up text messages between him and his cousin Peter. Paul held out the phone, and the detective working with Psalm took it from him. Then he and Psalm scrolled through a series of text messages that Peter had sent to Paul over the past couple of weeks, and in these texts were a series of very harsh criticisms of Roberto. Peter had messaged Paul to tell him that the rice fields were a total mess and that it was all Roberto's fault, and that Roberto really needed to be fired. There were also text exchanges between the cousins in which Peter talked openly about wanting to physically attack Roberto. After talking a bit longer, the conversation reached its natural conclusion, at which point Paul got up and Psalm thanked him for coming in, and then after Paul had left, Psalm quickly gathered the other members of his team. Peter's very hot-tempered reputation and those text messages they had just seen were enough to immediately make Peter their primary suspect. But there was something else that jumped out to Detective Psalm. The ATF agent that Psalm had met with said he believed whoever planted the bomb that killed Roberto would have to understand how the electrical equipment worked, because the bomb had been connected to the high-voltage system used to start the irrigation pumps. And Detective Psalm knew that Peter had spent the bulk of his life on the family farm, and he had grown up learning every aspect of the business, so he would absolutely know how the electrical equipment worked. So Psalm didn't waste any time. Using the text messages from Paul and evidence the ATF and FBI had found at the crime scene, Psalm secured a warrant to search Peter's house and to conduct around-the-clock surveillance on him. Psalm hoped he could bring this case to a close within a couple of days. On July 19th, so 3 days after the explosion that killed Roberto, Detective Psalm and his team rifled through everything inside of Peter's house. As Psalm led the search, one thing kept coming into his mind, and it wasn't Peter's possible guilt or even the explosion itself. It was the bravery that Roberto's 7-year-old son Fabian had shown. This boy had been just feet away from the explosion. Shards of glass literally had flown at him, and he had seen the horrific sight of fire ravaging his father's body. But this little kid had turned and ran miles to get help. As terrified as he must have been, he had done everything he could to try to save his father. So Psalm told himself that he not only owed it to Roberto to solve this case, he also owed it to Fabian. It was Psalm's job now to do everything he could, just like Fabian had done. Psalm was standing in Peter's home office when a deputy came in to tell him that Peter and his wife had just pulled up in front of the house. Psalm nodded and went to meet them. Peter was already rushing towards the front door when Psalm stepped outside. And Peter started yelling immediately. He wanted to know what the police were doing there. And Psalm told him they had a search warrant, and so Peter knew right away that he had to be a suspect in Roberto's murder. Then Peter did something that took Psalm by complete surprise. Right there in front of his wife and other police officers, Peter launched into a tirade about how arrogant Roberto had been and how he had never liked Roberto. But Peter said that just because he didn't like Roberto, it didn't mean that he, Peter, was a killer. After this exchange, Psalm just nodded and walked back into the house to continue the search, while other officers stayed outside with Peter and his wife. The initial search of Peter's property didn't provide police with a smoking gun or anything like that, but they did confiscate Peter's computers and his cell phone. And when Psalm left the house, he was still convinced Peter was the killer. This guy couldn't even contain his hatred for the victim, while police were actively searching his house. But as investigators began their surveillance of Peter and they continued to search other properties that belonged to Peter, this case would take a baffling turn. And Detective Psalm would soon start to feel like he was living in some kind of Hollywood crime thriller. On the morning of August 12th, almost a month after Roberto's murder, Detective Psalm sat down at his desk at the sheriff's department, and when he did, he saw there was an envelope with the words Ayala case written on it. The words had been made with a label maker and then photocopied onto a piece of paper, and the small envelope had 8 stamps on it, way more than were needed to send it in the mail. Psalm opened the envelope and took out a letter that was addressed to the investigators. Just like the front of the envelope, the words in the letter had been created with a label maker and then copied. Psalm and his team had spent the past few weeks continuing their surveillance on Peter Moore. They still hadn't found any evidence tying Peter directly to the crime scene, but Psalm was confident they were getting close. In fact, Peter's uncle had provided Psalm with a phone message in which Peter had called, begging his uncle to talk to get Peter's father to put Peter back in his will. After that, Psalm had discovered that Peter's father, one of the Moore brothers, had not only cut Peter out of his financial inheritance, but he also had cut Peter completely out of the family business. So Peter wouldn't take over at all when the Moore brothers retired. Instead, Paul would run the company, and Roberto Ayala would be his right-hand man. All of the clues in this case pointed right to Peter, as far as Detective Psalm was concerned. But now Psalm was staring at this bizarre letter, and he had no idea what to think. The letter was written by a man who claimed to be a hired assassin. The assassin said that he had been paid to take out Roberto by a well-known violent international criminal gang called MS-13. The assassin said that Roberto's brother had tried to rip off members of MS-13 in an international drug deal, and so they had Roberto killed as revenge. But that wasn't all. The assassin said MS-13 wanted him, the assassin, to strike again and kill Roberto's brother and other members of his family next. But this assassin said they had seen the light and did not want to kill anyone anymore, so he was now trying to help the police without giving himself up. Psalm put the letter down and just stared off into space for a minute. He was a detective in a small sheriff's department in a small county. This case was already bigger than anything he'd ever dealt with, and now he had this letter from an assassin like a cop would get in some kind of a crazy action movie. None of this made any sense to Psalm, and he was at a loss for what to do next. So he reached out to his new contacts in the ATF and the FBI and shared the letter with them. The federal agents agreed with Psalm that the letter was very strange, but they didn't want to ignore any possible lead. And so they started to investigate the MS-13 crime group to see if they could find any connection to Roberto, his brother, or anybody else in the county. Then, 2 days later, Detective Psalm was back at the station, and he found another envelope with the same kind of label on it as the last one sitting on his desk. And when he opened this envelope, he found a single page with a detailed diagram of the bomb that was supposedly used to kill Roberto. Psalm immediately contacted ATF agents, and when they looked at this diagram, they confirmed that it matched the type of homemade bomb they believed had killed Roberto. So whoever sent this diagram, professional assassin or otherwise, definitely had intimate details about the murder weapon. So, over the next week, the investigation shifted focus to MS-13 and the letters Salm had received. Still, Salm never gave up on the idea that Peter Moore had been involved in Roberto's murder in some way. But Salm still could not find clear evidence that could tie Peter to the murder. And investigators also couldn't identify or locate this mysterious assassin who had supposedly sent these letters. So Salm and his team started to lose hope. They had felt kind of overwhelmed from the beginning of this investigation, and now things had gotten so crazy and far-fetched that they couldn't even see how they were going to figure out what had really happened to Roberto. And Salm really felt guilty, like he was letting Fabian and the rest of Roberto's family down. On August 20th, over a week after that first letter arrived, Salm was sitting at his desk. At this point, he almost expected something totally bizarre and straight out of a movie to happen daily in this investigation. And almost on cue, Salm's phone rang. He answered, and he heard a muffled voice on the other end. Salm asked who was calling, but the person wouldn't say who they were. They simply said they had information about Roberto's murder that investigators needed to hear. Then, the caller said one simple thing and hung up. And once again, Detective Salm sat there stunned. This just seemed like more crazy movie stuff to him. But then he felt a jolt of energy. Something the anonymous caller said suddenly made complete sense to Salm. He got up from his desk and called his team together. Then he contacted the federal agents who had been working with them. Salm told them all about this phone call he just got, and then he showed them a piece of evidence that he thought supported what the caller had just said. And everyone on the team thought Salm was definitely onto something. It would take several weeks for investigators to put everything together, but they would eventually figure out what happened to Roberto out on that isolated farm road. Based on the anonymous phone call and evidence discovered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the day of Roberto Ayala's murder, July 16, 2011. A flashlight clicked on, but it was still very dark on the secluded farm road. The sun wouldn't come up for a few hours, and the bomber thought there was something eerie about this place in the total darkness, like someone or something could be hiding anywhere out in the rice fields, watching. The bomber shook off those thoughts, though, and followed the beam of light down the road towards the wooden pole with the large metal box attached to it. The bomber wore all black and had a large black bag slung over their shoulder. The bomber walked down the road and eventually reached the pole, at which point they put the bag on the ground. Then they opened up the high-voltage metal box and then crouched down and unzipped their bag. They shined the flashlight into the bag, and they could see the homemade pipe bomb they'd constructed. It hadn't been easy, but everything they had read made them feel confident that this pipe bomb would function the way it was supposed to when the time came. The bomber reached into the bag and slowly and carefully began to set up the pipe bomb inside of the metal box. There was a line that would be pulled when the door to the box was opened and the irrigation switch was flipped, and that line would engage a trigger that would set off the explosives inside of the pipe bomb. As the bomber worked, they could feel sweat dripping down their forehead, but they took a deep breath, kept their hands steady, and finished the job. The bomber closed and locked the door to the metal box and exhaled. Then they walked back down the farm road to their vehicle and drove into the darkness. Now all they had to do was wait. Hours later, at around 1 p.m., Roberto parked his white F-250 truck on the road and told his son Fabian he'd be right back. Roberto stepped out of the truck, and before he began walking down the road, he turned around and glanced back at his truck, and he smiled. He could see Fabian looking back at the sunflower field in the distance. Roberto turned back around and continued walking towards the pole, and as he did, he put on his electrical gloves, and then when he reached the pole, he opened up the door to the high-voltage metal box and flipped the switch to start the irrigation system. The explosion was enormous and instantaneous, and Roberto actually died instantly from electrocution coming out of the box. But as his body fell to the ground, it was wreathed in flames caused by the explosion of the pipe bomb. The ground shook, and in the truck, Fabian was covered in pieces of glass from the shattered windshield and windows. But Fabian remained courageous and leapt out of the truck and ran towards his father, who was literally on fire. Fabian thought about trying to reach through the flames to pull his dad's phone out of his jeans pocket to try to call for help, but the fire was just too much. And so after taking one last look at his dad, the 7-year-old turned and just started running. Later that afternoon, one of the Moore brothers' phones rang. It was the police, and they were telling him what had happened to Roberto. He hung up and he started crying. Then he looked across the table and told his son what he just heard. His son looked stunned. He said there was no way this could be true. But as an outward expression of hurt and confusion came across the son's face, internally, the son felt completely relieved because he knew his homemade pipe bomb had just worked. Paul Moore had killed Roberto, not his cousin Peter, who Paul immediately had thrown under the bus. It would turn out that Paul hated Roberto just as much as Peter did, but Paul did a better job hiding it. And when Peter had lost his inheritance and his chance to someday run the family farm, Paul had begun to fear that his father and uncle could do the same thing to him. And then the Moore brothers had begun to talk about possibly making Roberto a financial partner in the business, and at that point, Paul had just had enough. And so Paul got to work building his pipe bomb. He knew Roberto's irrigation schedule, so he knew exactly when and where to plant the bomb. While he waited for the day to come that he would be able to kill Roberto, Paul began accumulating evidence that would send investigators directly to his cousin Peter. In fact, Paul was the man who had brought ATF and FBI agents the piece of metal found in the canal that made it clear Roberto had been killed with a bomb. But when investigators failed to arrest Peter right away, Paul had decided he would need to throw them even further off of his trail. Paul was the one who had created the letters from the assassin, and he had dreamed up the story about Roberto's brother being connected to MS-13. Paul thought it was a perfect plan, like something right out of a movie. But it was actually the fake assassin letters that eventually got Paul busted. The anonymous caller who contacted Detective Salm told him that he was looking into the wrong cousin. Paul, not Peter, was the guilty party. At first, Salm had thought the anonymous caller was maybe just Peter trying to now throw suspicion on Paul, but then, as Salm thought about it, something from early on in the case came back to him. In the text message exchanges between Peter and Paul often used numbers as abbreviations for words, like using the number 4 in a sentence like, "I have something for you." He would actually put the 4 instead of FOR. And when Salm went back to the letters from the supposed assassin, it turned out the assassin used the same type of abbreviations. And so with this anonymous call, which by the way would stay anonymous, we don't know who called that in, and the connection between Paul's texts and the assassin's letters, Salm and his team searched Paul's home. And tucked away in his office, they found evidence that did link him to the diagram of the bomb that the alleged assassin had sent to the police. And soon after that, police arrested Paul. Paul was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Roberto's son, Fabian, who had so bravely tried to run to save his father on the day he was killed, spearheaded a project to erect a memorial in his father's honor at the elementary school where Roberto had gone as a child. And in 2022, Fabian graduated from high school as a varsity football and soccer star. A popular YouTuber named Dan Bell explores abandoned buildings and then uploads that footage to his very popular This Is Dan Bell page that has over 500,000 subscribers. Unlike other urban exploration YouTube channels, Dan is not trying to create scary content. In fact, many of his most popular videos are taken in buildings that haven't even been abandoned yet, like in a Kmart that's shutting down and all the shelves are empty, and he walks around and it's kind of eerie because it's this huge store that's now coming to an end. But again, it's not really scary. But amongst those popular videos, there is one that is horrifying, and it's called the Super Creepy Abandoned Asylum. One of the top comments on this video is from a verified YouTube account with over 1 million subscribers. They're called The Proper People, and they say, "This may be the creepiest urban exploration video I have ever seen." The video opens with Dan coming up to this huge old house that looks like nature is reclaiming it with all the vines and grass and everything overgrown all around it. And for the first minute and a half, Dan is just quietly walking around the perimeter of this building, and you don't really know what it is, besides obviously the captions given away it's an asylum, but it doesn't look like an asylum. It looks like a random house in the middle of the woods. After about a minute and a half, Dan makes his way over to the side of this building, and he sees there are some stone steps that go down into a door that clearly feeds into the basement of this building. Dan walks down the stairs, he opens the door, and he walks into this hallway, and as soon as he goes in, because his camera had been filming in very bright sunshine outside, it takes a minute for it to focus on the hallway, which is totally dark. But once the camera focuses, you see all this old clothing strewn about on the ground, and the paint is peeling off the walls in every part of the building. When Dan filmed this, he was not out loud narrating as he walked around the building. Instead, while he was editing the footage, he must have recorded himself doing a narration, and that narration picks up as soon as he gets in the hallway and the camera has focused. He begins walking down this hallway, and you hear under his boots the crunch of broken glass. And as he's walking, you hear Dan's voice say, "This is a children's asylum that shut down sometime in the 1990s. It was briefly leased sometime in the 2000s, but for the most part, over the past 3 decades, this building has been totally abandoned." After he gives this brief history, which sounds like he's done this dozens of times on other videos, he pauses and says, "You know, something really strange happened while I was filming inside of this building." He heard what sounded like someone running around on the top floor of this building. He's used to going into abandoned buildings and finding creatures, animals running around. That was not unusual. And so instinctively, he assumes it's got to be some animal that's taken up residence on the top floor. And so he doesn't worry about it. He ends up walking around the whole first floor before making his way upstairs. And he said when he got up there, he was expecting to see some animal or some sign of an animal living up there, but he didn't. He didn't see anything. It just looked like every other abandoned building. And after filming what he wanted to film, he eventually leaves the building and goes home. It wasn't until he loaded the footage onto his computer and began reviewing it that he noticed 2 specific instances while he was inside this asylum where clearly someone else is in the room with him. Dan speculates that perhaps a former patient has come back here and is living in one of the rooms upstairs. Here are the 2 segments from his video that show this kind of phantom person lurking in the shadows. In the first clip, keep your eyes on the door that is open leading downstairs. You'll see there is a shadow on the door that is being cast from whatever is standing at the top of the stairs just outside of our view. And at some point, as Dan is filming down the hall, that shadow vanishes down the stairs. In the second clip, when Dan walks into the room, look to the back left-hand side of the room at the door, specifically at the open hole where there should be a doorknob. You will see there is very clearly someone looking through the hole at Dan, and when Dan films this person, they run away. Missy Beavers was a wife, a mother of 3 girls, and a hardcore fitness instructor. She lived in Midlothian, Texas, and she taught a fitness boot camp out of a local church at least 1 day a week, every week. Missy was extremely bubbly and outgoing, and everybody seemed to really like her, and her personality really shined on social media, where she was an avid Facebook user, often posting multiple times a day, every day of the week. Missy would post information about upcoming fitness classes, either that she was teaching or that she was simply participating in. She would also post her own fitness regimen and her diet. She was just very focused on health. She also shared fairly personal things, like pictures of her family and where they were going and what they were up to. And she left her personal cell phone right on her Facebook page. So clearly, Missy was fine with kind of being out there. On April 17th, 2016, there was a weather report that came in that the next day there was going to be really heavy rain, in particular in the morning. And Missy's class was scheduled for the next morning at 5 a.m. and she started getting calls and text messages from the people who were going to that class asking, is this class still going to happen? By 7:55 p.m. that night, so many people had asked about it that she decided to just put a public post on her Facebook page addressing the weather. And it just said, if it's raining, we're still training, no excuses, you are gladiators. On the post, she included directions of how to get to the church, where this class was going to be in the church, what time they were starting, and what they could expect. Later that night at 9:23 p.m., she did another Facebook post that said, going to bed, I have to get up tomorrow at 3:30. The next day at 4:16 in the morning, a street security camera picked up Missy pulling into the church's parking lot. Even though her class didn't start until 5 a.m., she liked to get there early to make sure the classroom was set up and to warm up a little bit and make sure she was super motivated and cheerful as soon as they walked in. The security cameras inside the church capture Missy walking in through the front doors at 4:20 in the morning. Then, just before 5 a.m., the first couple of students arrived at the classroom and they walk in to find Missy laying on the ground, bleeding from her head, totally unresponsive. They call 911, police and paramedics show up, and as soon as they get there, they pronounce Missy dead. Initially, there was some speculation that she might have fallen and hit her head, but they noticed all these puncture marks in her head that looked intentionally inflicted, like someone had struck her. And later, when they reviewed the security footage from inside the church, it was confirmed that she definitely was murdered. Earlier that morning at 3:50 a.m., so 26 minutes before Missy arrives in the church parking lot, an unknown figure wearing police tactical gear from head to toe breaks into the church. From 3:50 in the morning when they first get inside the church to 4:20 in the morning when Missy walks through the front doors, this unknown figure just kind of strolls casually up and down the halls of this church. It looked like they were carrying a hammer or perhaps a crowbar, and periodically as they're kind of casually walking down the hall, they would turn to a window of a door and they would break it with whatever they're holding in their hand, and then they would just keep walking on. Like there was no reason for them to break the window, they're just bored. And this was actually an important point that police would make about this footage. This person walking around does not appear to want to vandalize the church. I mean, they're breaking a couple windows, but they could have done a lot more damage to the building, and they didn't. They don't appear to be looking to steal anything, and in fact, later, police would confirm that nothing was stolen. What it looks like they're doing is just kind of wasting time, like they have some clear objective for being here, but they can't do it quite yet. They're waiting for a trigger of some kind, and it would turn out that that trigger was Missy walking through those doors at 4:20 in the morning. As soon as Missy made her way into the classroom, the assailant followed her and proceeded to beat her to death with whatever they were holding in their hand. By the time police arrived a little after 5 a.m., the suspect was long gone. Initially, police believed it was going to be fairly easy to identify who killed Missy. The person on camera wearing the tactical gear had a very distinctive gait with their feet turned out, and they walked with a bit of a limp, and they had very slouched posture. And the police figured as soon as we put this surveillance footage out in the public domain, someone's going to come forward and say they recognize this person. But despite the hundreds of leads that poured in from people after watching this video saying, oh yeah, I know this person, well, the police checked into all of them and they all checked out. Everybody had an alibi. And so years later, the police are still not able to identify who killed Missy or why, and so her case remains unsolved. Here is the security footage of Missy's killer casually walking around the halls, aimlessly smashing windows and opening doors, just waiting for Missy to show up. In March of 2015, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer. Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, "You gotta go." And Tamara just says, "No, I'm not leaving." This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't, and they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then of course, the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, "You shouldn't even be here, you need to leave." And Tamara's like, "No, I'm not gonna leave." And so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave, just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair." Immediately, the tension is gone in the room, they're no longer fighting, and Valentina is happy that she's finally gonna get her apartment back, and Tamara says, "Look, I'll make us dinner tonight, I'll go out and get some food." Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills, and then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner, and as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 in the morning, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills. But it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. And they're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, "Your friend, your relative, was just found deceased and we need to look around the apartment." Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it. And they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. and there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them. Not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular, human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight. She says, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail. Here is the surveillance footage of Tamara disposing of Valentina's body, as well as some shots of Tamara during her trial. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we do sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and also some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt, script editing by Scott